It took exactly 47 seconds, the time it takes a clerk to read a budget line item, for the foundation of the administration's counterintelligence defense to buckle. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but the sound of political capital collapsing in the vast, echoing chamber of the Senate hearing room. This was the moment Washington had simultaneously anticipated and dreaded. The final confrontation between institutional guardrails and pure, political defiance. The room itself, Senate Hart Building Room 216, was built for moments like this, though perhaps not for such an embarrassing display of legal fragility. Mahogany paneling, dark and reflective, absorbed the harsh light cast by the rows of high-intensity fluorescent ceiling fixtures. On the dais, 12 senators of the Select Committee on Intelligence sat arranged in a semicircle, their faces illuminated in the clinical white glare, giving them the aspect of stern, unblinking judges. Across from them, isolated at a heavy oak table, sat the witness, Mr. Elias Thorne, Deputy Director of National Security, DDNS. Thorne was a man who, until 6 weeks prior, had projected an aura of impenetrable confidence, the administration's indispensable firewall against oversight. Now, under the unyielding focus of the cameras and the steady, quiet gaze of the ranking member, Senator Marcus Thorne appeared diminished. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, yet the fabric seemed to hang heavily on his shoulders, and the knot of his tie was cinched just a fraction too tightly, a visual chokehold. The atmosphere was not one of loud, frantic crossfire, but of controlled, dense pressure. The only audible sounds were the soft, rhythmic clicking of photographer shutters, a gentle, ceaseless rain of flashes, and the slight rustle of papers as staff members passed documents to their principals. Senator Marcus, a veteran prosecutor whose demeanor was always deceptively calm, leaned forward slightly, his posture emphasizing the vast, physical distance between his moral authority and the witness's position. The microphone before him was static black, catching every controlled inflection of his voice. The political stakes were immediate and catastrophic. The investigation centered on whether the DDNS office had improperly leveraged classified intelligence streams for political opposition research, a clear violation of both Executive Order 12333, which governs intelligence activities, and the Hatch Act, which restricts political activity by executive branch employees. The official narrative from the administration was one of procedural missteps. Senator Marcus intended to prove it was a deliberate, legal trespass. The political tone was intensely polarized. The majority side was rigid in its defense of Thorne, painting the hearing as a partisan witch hunt, while the minority saw it as the necessary exposure of institutional rot. Every subtle movement, from Thorne adjusting his glasses to a senator shifting a briefing book, was freighted with political consequence. The air was heavy, not just with humidity, but with the expectation of collapse. Thorne's initial testimony had been tight, legalistic, and evasive, relying heavily on the phrase, "that falls outside the scope of my administrative purview." But the paper trail, as Senator Marcus knew, rarely respected administrative purview. The silence grew heavy as Senator Marcus picked up a thin, unmarked manila folder. The quiet was only disrupted by the faint, high-pitched hum of the fluorescent lights above. The DDNS took a sip of water, his hand shaking slightly against the glass. The camera flashes ceased, replaced by the steady red light of the recording indicators. The stage was set for the procedural dissection of a political career. But the silence wasn't over yet. Senator Marcus allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of the institution press down upon Mr. Thorne before finally addressing him. "Mr. Thorne, let's establish a clear administrative baseline. In your role as Deputy Director of National Security, you are intimately familiar with Executive Order 13526, specifically concerning the control and declassification of national security information. Is that correct?" Thorne cleared his throat. "Yes, Senator. My office adheres rigorously to all standing executive orders and statutory requirements pertaining to classified material. We have robust internal controls." His voice was steady, perhaps overly so, suggesting a rehearsed answer to the most obvious opening query. "Rigorous adherence," Senator Marcus repeated, noting the phrase on his yellow pad with a precise, almost surgical flourish. "Let's turn to the budget, specifically subprogram 47B, within the Supplemental Intelligence Appropriations for fiscal year 2025. That allocation, amounting to $4.2 million, was designated solely for secure tactical counter-surveillance (STCS) assets, meaning physical infrastructure and authorized technology for active counterintelligence missions. Is that the correct designation, Mr. Thorne? Thorne shifted slightly, leaning into the microphone. That figure is accurate, Senator. And yes, STCS refers to the assets used by our Field Operations Unit in their authorized mandate. He sounded more comfortable discussing budgets than legal philosophy, a typical bureaucrat's refuge. Now, on June 14th of this year, an internal Department of Justice Inspector General preliminary audit flagged $1 million of that $4.2 million as being expended on non-authorized digital profiling and external data aggregation services. Mr. Thorne, can you confirm that $1 million, nearly 26% of a tactical budget, was diverted from secure physical assets to pay an external, non-cleared vendor for digital aggregation? Thorne's practiced calm fractured for a brief, discernible instant. His eyes flickered rapidly to his legal counsel seated beside him, a moment that spoke volumes in the high-definition feed. He quickly looked back at Senator Marcus, adjusting his focus. Senator, I believe the IG's preliminary assessment utilized an overly broad definition of tactical assets. The funds were used to support the mission of counter-surveillance by providing enhanced situational awareness, which is functionally equivalent to a physical asset in the modern intelligence environment. Senator Marcus ignored the definitional debate. He pressed closer to the legal jeopardy. Functionally equivalent is not legally equivalent, Mr. Thorne. Under the Anti-Deficiency Act, 31 U.S.C. Section 1341, an officer of the government may not expend appropriated funds for a purpose different from that for which they were appropriated. Diverting funds designated specifically for secure tactical counter-surveillance assets to pay for digital profiling by an external vendor is not only a policy violation, it appears to be a statutory violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Yes or no, were the funds spent on the purpose for which Congress appropriated them? The room was utterly still, the tension thick enough to be physical. The cameras, now zoomed in tight, captured the slight tremor in Thorne's left hand, resting on the polished table. He took a measured breath. The funds were expended within the operational parameters of the counter-surveillance mission, Senator. The legal interpretations of appropriations language are complex, and we relied on internal general counsel guidance that this fell under the necessary and proper execution of the mandate. He was buying time, deflecting the blame onto internal legal counsel. Mr. Thorne, the mandate was STCS assets. The expenditure was digital profiling. That is a documented contradiction. If you knowingly directed those funds to be spent outside their authorized purpose, did you violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, yes or no? Senator Marcus's voice remained level, a surgical blade testing the witness's defenses. Thorne's expression hardened, replacing fear with a defiant institutionalism. The subtle cross-examination was building a legal trap based on paper, not philosophy. But the paper trail went deeper than he realized. Senator Marcus nodded slowly, acknowledging Thorne's evasive answer without accepting it. He then turned his attention to a different, more damaging file. The shift in topic was designed to disorient the witness and expose the systemic failure beneath the financial misstep. Let us move from the Anti-Deficiency Act to the issue of procedural fairness, Mr. Thorne. Intelligence agencies operate under strictures designed to protect the rights of American persons. This is not optional. It is a fundamental constitutional requirement rooted in the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause, that the government cannot deprive any person of liberty or property without due process of law. Do you agree that procedural safeguards are essential to maintaining the constitutional integrity of intelligence gathering? Absolutely, Senator. Every action taken by my office is vetted by our legal division to ensure compliance with constitutional protections, Thorne insisted, regaining some of his composure. He was comfortable with the platitude, less so with the specifics. Senator Marcus paused, allowing a staff member to quietly slide a single, heavily redacted document in front of the witness. The document, clearly marked internal, privileged eyes only, bore the seal of the National Security Council, NSC. I hold in my hand a memorandum from the NSC General Counsel's office, dated March 3rd of this year, which directly addresses the program associated with your $1 million expenditure, the Digital Profiling Initiative. This memo explicitly warns your office that using non-cleared, external data aggregation services to monitor U.S. citizens, even if only aggregating public data, runs the risk of creating a chilling effect and, more critically, violates the Department of Justice's own internal minimization guidelines regarding the retention of American persons' data. Senator Marcus leaned forward. Paragraph 4, Section C, explicitly states that this methodology constitutes a deliberate circumvention of established FISA Section 702 acquisition procedures and poses a severe risk of violating the Fourth Amendment guarantee against unreasonable searches and seizures. Mr. Thorne, the General Counsel warned you in writing that your project risked violating the Fourth Amendment and bypassing established legal surveillance authority. Why did you proceed? Thorne's breath hitched. The contradiction was stark. His prior claim of robust internal controls was demolished by the existence of a clear, ignored warning. He grasped the edges of the table, his knuckles white. Senator, with all due respect, that memo was part of an ongoing internal legal debate regarding the scope of our mission. It was not a final, binding directive. The mission objectives, identifying foreign influence operations, were deemed too critical to pause based on an advisory memo. He was now sweating visibly under the hot lights, his evasion becoming desperate. So you admit to receiving a formal, written warning that your initiative was constitutionally dubious and yet you authorized the continuation of expenditures, in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, to fund the very program the NSC Council flagged as potentially violating the Fourth Amendment. Senator Marcus's tone was no longer calm. It was a measured, cold certainty. Did you or did you not sign the continuance authorization for the digital profiling contract on March 15th, 12 days after receiving this explicit warning? The camera zoomed out slightly, capturing the rigid silence of the Senate committee and the solitary, sweating figure of Thorne. He was trapped in the legal maze of his own making, where bureaucratic arrogance met the cold text of the Constitution. He stalled, attempting to find a political exit from a legal cul-de-sac. I signed numerous authorizations that month, Senator. I would have to review the specific document. His voice was a strained whisper. Senator Marcus's eyes narrowed. The document, Mr. Thorne, authorized the expenditure that led directly to the constitutional jeopardy. And now, let's talk about those 47 seconds that followed. But the constitutional failure was only half the story. Senator Marcus picked up a single sheet of paper, the contrast of the bright white against the mahogany table sharp and definitive. He did not speak immediately, instead focusing his entire, intense gaze upon Mr. Thorne, who was now visibly trembling, his practiced institutional veneer dissolving under the sustained legal scrutiny. Mr. Thorne, let us return to the cornerstone of American legal protection, the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. It states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process, in the context of government surveillance, means the government must have a legally valid warrant or statutory authorization to target an American person. When your office bypassed FISA and used external vendors for digital profiling, as detailed in the NSC memo, you moved from intelligence gathering into the realm of domestic law enforcement, correct? Thorne swallowed hard. No, Senator. Our mission remained strictly counterintelligence. We were identifying foreign vectors. But you were processing data on American persons within the United States, utilizing funds appropriated for tactical assets, Senator Marcus countered, his voice suddenly dropping to an almost dangerous level of quiet. Let's assume your internal lawyer gave you bad advice and that you genuinely believed your actions were legal. I want to test that belief. I need you to articulate, in this public forum, the difference between substantive due process and procedural due process in the context of the Fifth Amendment. Specifically, how did your operation ensure it complied with procedural due process when targeting U.S. citizens? The question was simple, yet foundational, a legal trap set not on a specific statute, but on constitutional principle. It required the witness to articulate the legal framework of his claimed authority. It took exactly 47 seconds for Thorne's world to collapse. He stared blankly at the senator, his eyes wide and unfocused. He began to speak, attempting to rely on the generalities that had served him before. Procedural due process, Senator, ensures that the government follows the necessary steps before acting. We followed the steps laid out in our office charter, which means we adhered to the process. Which process, Mr. Thorne? The judicial process, the requirement of a warrant signed by a judge? Or the administrative process, a simple memo signed by a political appointee? Substantive due process is about whether the government has a valid reason to act. Procedural due process is about whether the government followed the right process when it acted. Your operation, by its own internal admission, bypassed the legal process, FISA, to conduct surveillance that compromised American persons' data. Did you secure a judicial finding of probable cause before initiating the monitoring of these individuals? Thorne was visibly sweating, his composure entirely gone. He stammered, his earlier defiance turning into raw panic. We did not require a judicial finding. We were relying on the Attorney General's classified finding of national security relevance, which is standard, that is the standard operating procedure. Standard operating procedure for what, Mr. Thorne? Senator Marcus's voice was now a sharp, undeniable crack. For an executive intelligence action outside the United States? Yes. But inside the United States, targeting American citizens? No. That standard operating procedure is a direct, fatal violation of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment because it deprives those citizens of liberty, specifically their expectation of privacy, without the process required by law, a warrant. You knowingly substituted an administrative memo for a judicial mandate. The witness suddenly contradicted his earlier sworn statement about relying on counsel. In a flash of exposed legal ignorance, he blurted, "My counsel told me that as long as the data was publicly available, even aggregated, due process requirements did not apply." The fatal error was made. Senator Marcus seized on the contradiction immediately. "Mr. Thorne, you just claimed your counsel advised you that due process does not apply to publicly available data. That claim contradicts your prior testimony where you asserted your office rigorously adhered to all constitutional protections. Furthermore, it demonstrates a gross, inexcusable ignorance of established law. The Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed that the aggregation and analysis of public data can absolutely constitute a search under the Fourth Amendment, which triggers the procedural safeguard of the Fifth. Your fundamental legal failure here is fatal. You violated due process because you did not, and apparently did not understand that you needed to, secure a judicial mandate for what became domestic surveillance." The hammer had fallen. The sound of the microphones picking up Thorne's ragged breathing was deafening. He stared straight ahead, defeated, his political career shattered not by malice, but by the exposed lack of fundamental constitutional competence. The air was heavy with the stench of institutional failure. The political earthquake began not with a bang, but with the sudden, collective intake of breath from every journalist, staffer, and legal analyst watching the live feed. The 47-second sequence was immediately clipped, timestamped, and disseminated across every major news network before Mr. Thorne had even finished stammering his final, legally fatal admission. Within the hour, the network news anchors, typically restrained, were using language usually reserved for indictments. On MSNBC, the constitutional scholar, Dr. Elena Vargas, appeared visibly shaken. She stated, "Constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate." Thorne's defense collapsed not on a factual dispute, but on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Bill of Rights. For 47 seconds, America watched competence collapse. He did not just violate a statute. He exposed an institutional mindset that views the Fifth Amendment as a mere administrative hurdle, rather than a bedrock guarantee. Over on Fox News, even analysts generally sympathetic to the administration struggled to defend the legal failure. "This isn't about politics. This is about legal liability," argued former federal prosecutor Michael Vance. The contradiction was the political killer, but the ignorance of due process is the institutional crime. By admitting he relied on a policy that effectively swapped a judge's warrant for an internal memo, he exposed the entire program to civil suits and guaranteed a criminal probe into the Anti-Deficiency Act violation. He didn't just fail the test, he proved he didn't know the material. The consequences were immediate and institutional. The political fallout centered on the complete erosion of trust in the oversight process. Senate Majority Leadership, which had vigorously defended Thorne just that morning, issued terse, non-committal statements expressing disappointment and calling for an immediate, independent review. The institutional consequence was the immediate announcement by the Department of Justice, DOJ, that the entire digital profiling program would be shuttered, and a special counsel would be appointed to investigate the misuse of appropriated funds and the potential legal jeopardy for all agents involved. Public reaction was equally decisive. Within minutes of the breakdown, the hashtag #47seconds dominated social media, becoming a shorthand for the sudden, graphic exposure of arrogance in power. The image of Thorne, hands shaking and eyes wide, became the visual encapsulation of the moment when political spin failed to mask fundamental legal incompetence. The long-term institutional damage was to the office of the Deputy Director of National Security itself. The integrity of the DDNS was tied inextricably to its legal rigor and adherence to constitutional limitations. Thorne's collapse suggested that the political leadership of the intelligence community was either unable or unwilling to understand the laws that governed their immense power. This was far more damaging than any single policy failure. It was a crisis of legitimacy. Senator Marcus, in a brief, post-hearing address, summarized the gravity succinctly. This was not just an administrative mistake. It was a constitutional dereliction of duty, paid for with the public's trust and appropriated funds. We will ensure that this failure is fully prosecuted under the law. The institutional gears had begun to grind, setting in motion a chain reaction of resignations, investigations, and legislative reform calls that would echo for months. But the final price was yet to be tallied. The hearing room was cleared quickly after Thorne's departure. The cameras were packed, the senators dispersed, and the quiet, controlled chaos of staff collecting transcripts and briefing books settled over the space. In the aftermath, the mahogany tables reflected the soft, residual glow of the dimmed fluorescent lights, like the surface of still, cold water. The focus shifted from the intense drama of the confrontation to the quiet, immutable philosophical questions it raised about power, accountability, and the Constitution. The failure of Elias Thorne was not unique, but its exposure was absolute. It provided a rare, stark view into the mechanisms of a political bureaucracy that had mistaken tactical expediency for legal legitimacy. The core moral failure was the belief that the political imperative, the mission objectives he cited, could supersede the foundational legal framework of the United States. Thorne was not a common criminal. He was an institutionalist who convinced himself that efficiency was a higher value than due process. The legal reality remains uncompromising. The Administrative Procedure Act, APA, and the constitutional requirements of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments are not suggestions. They are the fixed boundaries of government action. Thorne's exposed ignorance of the difference between procedural due process, the mechanism of legal protection, and substantive due process, the justification for action, demonstrated that the safeguards Congress legislates and the Constitution guarantees had been fundamentally misunderstood, or willfully ignored, at a critical level of power. The consequences extended far beyond Thorne's career. The investigation would now dissect the culture that allowed the Anti-Deficiency Act to be so cavalierly violated and the Due Process Clause to be so arrogantly bypassed. It was a moment of reflection for the entire intelligence community, forcing a painful reassessment of internal legal training and oversight mechanisms. The message sent by the Senate was clear and cold. The political mandate, however critical, ceases at the border of constitutional law. Washington demands not only loyalty and execution but also legal precision. Outside, the marble hallways were already echoing with the start of the next political cycle, the debate having pivoted entirely from what the intelligence community did to how they did it, and under whose authority. The incident served as a stark reminder that in the hyperrealistic landscape of modern American politics, competence is not a shield against accountability, it is the minimum requirement for legitimacy. The silence returned to the hearing room, a vast, echoing emptiness where a man's professional life had been methodically dismantled. Some careers end in scandal. His ended in silence. Washington doesn't punish ignorance. It replaces it.